next, oh, thank you. Hi, I'm Melissa Korff, and I have from Harvard Medical School, and I have the pleasure of being one of the co-chairs of the contracts subcommittee. And I also am sort of the outgoing co-chair of the data stewardship subcommittee. And since a lot of these issues kind of go hand in hand, we are combining some discussions from both subcommittees for today's session. I'm going to be joined by Alex Albanek, who is an outgoing chair of the contract subcommittee. She's, as you might have heard in the rest of the session, she's the new FDP co-chair, and so has had to give up that role, but you know, isn't quite ready to send her contracts committee off to college yet, I guess. And Missy Peloso from University of Pennsylvania, but also representing the COGR Contracts Committee. She'll be joined by Bob Hardy. It's a little bit of a late addition to talk a little bit about some collaborative work we're doing with COGR. And we'll also have a mini panel to talk a little bit about some of the CUI self-assessments, Andrea Lupu, Cindy Hope, and Tony Ventimiglia. Next slide, please. Just to give a little bit of an agenda for today's session, we're going to start with talking about Troublesome Clauses 2.0. Those of you that have been with the FDP for a little while might remember the Troublesome Clauses original database, which is older, it seems, than most of us might like to admit. Maybe it could drive now. I'm not sure. And some changes that we're looking at making to that database to enhance the usability and user friendliness. You know, from when that original database was developed, there are a lot more technical solutions for databases and collection of information like that. And how we're moving forward through the planning phase on that and leveraging a DoD request to COGR for some information as a way to pilot some questions and test out what information are we really looking for. We'll talk a little bit about Cnmc, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, and the NIST 800-171 Self-Assessment Registration Process in Fprs. That's where my mini panel is going to come in. We're also continuing to keep an eye on the pending CUI FAR case, which it seems like we've been doing for quite a little while now. And moving on to some of the data stewardship topics, we'll touch on the now final NIH policy for data management and sharing and talk through some ways that FGP might be able to support its member organizations in implementation while keeping in mind trying to minimize the associated administrative burden. Next slide, please. So since Alex was here for the inception of the Troublesome Clauses database, I'm going to turn it over to Alex to give a little bit of a background on the original database.
Thanks, Melissa. Good morning, everybody. I know we have a good number of new members, so I'm going to give a little bit of background on Troublesome Clauses and the contracts subcommittee. And I hope that all of the topics that we cover today will spark an interest and encourage you to work with us, including on our next version of Troublesome Clauses. I can't claim to be, I'm glad Bob Hardy is here with me, because I can't claim to be the founder of Troublesome Clauses. People just got to know me as that because FDP partnered with COGR probably about 13 years ago to do some data collection on behalf of our institutions that were chronically stuck with bad clauses, troublesome clauses that mostly were inappropriately included in DoD contracts. It actually started, there was the first troublesome clauses in 2004 that MIT worked with COGR to create, and you can still find that if you Google it. And essentially what it said was that although we have NSDD 189 affirming that, basic research should not be restricted, that grantee contractors were continuing and subcontractors were continuing to get restrictive clauses in the contracts that not only made it difficult to negotiate, but sometimes resulted in institutions walking and DoD losing out on that expertise. It started to rumble up again around 2008. And so Bob and I partnered together with FDP, was the data collection organization, and then Koger worked to analyze what we found and issued a report, which was very successful. It in fact resulted in a new memo from DoD reaffirming NSDD 189, and at that point in even a change to the 7,000 clause, because the 7,000 clause up until then was one of our biggest issues, and it wasn't coming necessarily always from DoD. It was coming from our prime contractors, companies that interpreted the terms that it was a mandatory flow down. So they actually did eventually, DoD did, the DFARS was modified in order to make it more clear at that time that it wasn't always a required if there was a fundamental research carve out. So in order to collect that data, we brought together a big group of people. We built a database, and this is the first page of this database. It's still up there, by the way. And so for FDP, we're not an advocacy organization, but we thought that everybody was suffering enough that it would be really good to be able to have a database that would show what types of issues people were encountering and what the outcomes. And it not only told you the outcomes, but you could even see what the original text of the clause was and then how it ended up, being ultimately negotiated. So it was a tool that really helped us be able to go back and say, look, my colleague at some institution, unidentified or not, was this installation at DoD allowed us to modify it this way. So it gave us some leverage. And then also, I'm sure all of you, as if you grew up as a contract officer like I did, you get your faculty who constantly say, why does it take so long? What is the issue? Nobody else has this problem. So we were actually be able to document on average how long it takes institutions to negotiate certain issues within a contract. So it really kind of provided cover too. So it was not only a great way to gather the data and to use it for Koger and AAU to look at it and try to help us fix some problems and work with our federal partners, but it was also a great tool, and it's still up there. Unfortunately, it's outdated. Next slide. So essentially, you just each time we would add a record, but the best part about it was that once you added these records and we gained a critical mass, people could go back and search a clause. So when you were dealing with a clause that was really troublesome, you could go in and you could search by the sponsor, or you could, the type of agreement. Surprisingly, it's not just contracts. We found quite a few RFPs, grants, cooperative agreements that also had these troublesome clauses. Or you could do a clause number, so any kind of standard, 7,000 or 7012, and then, or just look by the issue and see, and then look at the outcome. So it was a nice multi-search type of format. And next slide, please. And then this was very helpful for analyzing the data, but just being able to go in and run a report and see if you can see the types of issues that we were tracking. We were looking at publications, either the 7,000 or just a homegrown publication control clause, proprietary data restriction, because as we know, if they, proprietary data includes your research results, that's essentially a publication restriction. We expanded it later on for liability and indemnity. While it wasn't a focus for our DoD, report, it was something that a lot of people struggle with, and I think we still do today. Intellectual property restrictions, foreign national controls, and export controls. So those sorts of issues, and Melissa's going to talk a little bit more about, as we know, there's even more troublesome clauses out there now that I think that we would all be we've talked about this before in previous meetings, the information security clauses and how we're going to deal with that, and we're actually going to talk a little bit about that today. So that's just kind of a background. We're going to, as Melissa said, we're going to talk about a kickoff, and then hopefully, getting a new, more robust database that you can all participate, and we can use this as a tool for FDP moving forward. Next slide.
So as Alex said, we're in a little bit of a planning phase to move forward with a Troublesome Clauses Database 2.0. Reinventing the Troublesome Clauses database, updating the user interface to enhance usability, and I think probably important for everyone who has separate passwords for everything, unless LastPass is a good choice, because who can remember all the passwords? So ideally, we'll be able to allow a single password, so the password you would use to log into any other FTP system, you could use to log into the system as well. We also want to allow users to be able to easily identify how someone else may have tackled the same clause that they're struggling with. And potentially even, we want to make sure that we're allowing anonymous entry, because there are some institutions that wouldn't feel comfortable with sharing their information with their name attached to it. But in the event that an institution is willing to be contacted by other users of the database for more information, potentially also have that information on a colleague that you could reach out to for advice or words of wisdom, or maybe just sharing your challenges. As with the previous Troublesome Clauses database, it will be important for us to have access to the collective information in the database to enable us to have more detailed conversations with our agency partners to identify opportunities for streamlining negotiations. The data that says, we have 100 institutions that are struggling with a fundamental research determination, and it takes 90 to 120 days to start this, important research. How can we work together to try to streamline that? And either through FDP collaborations or, as we kind of started out the session with, COGR is the more advocacy organization between FDP and COGR. So, leveraging those opportunities for FDP to collect the data and demonstrate the issue, and then working with COGR to advocate with those organizations for some positive movement. We want to make sure that we develop a sustainability plan to ensure that the database remains responsive to the contracting issues of the day. I think that we had a luxury of a small amount of time in the contracting space where things were pretty stable, thanks to Alex and COGR's work with the original Troublesome Clauses database. We saw some good movement on some of the publication issues. And I think we find ourselves again in a place where there are a number of clauses that we want to be working to improve, and making sure that the database can be updated as those new sort of current contracting events hit the mainstream. We want to make sure that we're enabling reporting as necessary, so by topic area, clause, sponsor, or in this initial planning phase, whatever we identify would be most useful for having those conversations. And then leverage that information to disseminate whatever generalizable information we're able to pull together. We're hoping to be able to share a link to the old, I think it was a 2008 report that was generated using the previous database. And so we hope to be able to leverage this information to be able to generate similar reports as themes can be identified in the data. And one of the other important features of a reinvented, 2.0 database is that, some of the old clauses or older clauses that we had been dealing with, like the 7,000 clause, the problem there was the presence or absence of the clause. And if the clause was in the contract, we had to negotiate it out. Whereas now we're dealing with some contracting negotiation issues that are a little bit more complicated than that. Sure, we might be getting CUI and that could be okay, but it's not okay if it's not appropriately marked. And all of the other, downstream information that we're supposed to have isn't sent along with the clause. You know, the 7,000 clause, it requires us to have a fundamental research exclusion for it to be okay, and it's included in every contract, right? So now it's not just that clause is there, it's we're having trouble getting the fundamental research exclusion, or a little bit different type of negotiation challenges, a little bit more complex scenarios. And we want to make sure that we're developing the database to be able to handle some of those more nuanced negotiation challenges. Next slide, please. So as with the, you know, sort of a little bit back to the future, as with the original Troublesome Clauses database, we have the benefit of a request to COGR from the DoD for some information to help us pilot some questions, or, you know, help us figure out what we want to be including in the 2.0 database. And Missy Peloso and Bob Hardy are going to speak a little bit more to that.
Thank you, Melissa. This is Bob Hardy at COGR. So I was contacted by the DoD Basic Research Office around the end of November, early December. And what they were interested in was some real data from the universities about the issues that we're seeing with regard to what Alex and Melissa have just talked about. And what I was told by DoD is that basically everything is on the table right now when it comes to fundamental research, NSDD 189, and so forth. There's a lot of differing views within DoD about DoD policy with regard to fundamental research. So without being alarmist, they would like, the request to us was for us to try to get back to them with some real data on the kind of issues that people are seeing, the effect on the DoD project, and things like the time to resolution, et cetera, and so forth. Now, they would like, the request was that we provide them this information by the end of February, and we would have a DoD-wide session to discuss our findings. I'm not sure that that's going to hold for a couple of reasons. First of all, obviously there's a transition going on within DoD. And so we may have different players to deal with. Secondly, our chief contact at the Basic Research Office is on paternity leave, and I think he's not coming back till the end of the month. So I don't know whether the timing will hold. The other aspect of this is that there was a GAO report last year on export controls, and we were not very concerned about the findings in that report because they were basically focused on the agencies. But in the response to that report in May of last year, DoD said that they would be developing additional guidance on fundamental research, export controls, and so forth. And they have not done so yet. So the information that we can develop for them would be very helpful in their efforts to develop that guidance. So that's kind of the background on this. And I think, Missy, do you want to take it from here, or do we want to talk a little bit more about where this came from?
Sure. No, I'm happy to take. Thanks, Bob. That's very helpful. The COGR committee, Research Security and Intellectual Property Committee, has been working around this DoD request to put together what kind of questions should we be asking around this. And then we've been working very closely with Melissa and Alex and others on the FDP Contracting Committee to bring those questions in sync with what FDP members are interested in to try to get some data collection going here. Our plan is to do, I think, and Melissa mentioned this already, is to do a pilot over the next month or so, asking current working group members to provide information on DoD contracts through a Qualtrics survey, and use that as our baseline data for the interaction with DoD. So we plan to launch the survey shortly after this meeting. We'll probably have it open for about a month. And I would say, while we had planned on this being limited to the work group, I think if you have particular interest in providing data, we are always happy to collect data. So, please reach out to me, or please reach out to Melissa, or please reach out to Bob if you have specific issues that you would like DoD to know about, even if you're not in the initial request for that survey data. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is just a little bit of high level of some of the questions we're asking around this. We're asking about the Safeguarding Covered Defense Information and Cyber Reporting Clause, so DFARS 204-7012. What we are anecdotally hearing in the committee, and we're hearing this at COGR as well, is that there are a lot of instances where the clause may be inappropriately applied. People may recall that initially this was a mandatory clause and it was self-deleting without really being deleted if you did not have CDI or CUI. That's no longer the case, but many institutions are still seeing this clause just included in contracts as a matter of course. And so this is one area where we think that there's probably a disconnect between the contracting offices at our primes and at DoD and institutions. Have the next slide, please. We're also really interested in issues, as Bob said, related to NSDD 189 and the application of fundamental research, particularly in the context of DoD perhaps revisiting what should apply as fundamental research to academic institutions. So we're asking specific questions about, did you propose the work as fundamental research? Did the contractor agree with you that it was fundamental research? And if there was a disconnect, how did you negotiate? What did you negotiate? And what was the outcome? I think this will be really helpful to everyone. I know at my institution, we sometimes see PIs who think it's appropriate to just put one sentence in their statement of work. This is proposed as fundamental research without doing any real explanation of why it is. And of course, to DoD, they're also explaining military applications. So we want to make sure that how are people doing successfully negotiating and scoping fundamental research is a real issue for us. And then again, we're talking about the timing on the resolution as well. Next slide, please. And then we're asking about specific information about prime contractor and subcontractors. We're asking for one survey for each subcontract. I know that's clunky, but in the quick and dirty version of trying to get data together, I think it's going to be the easiest way to do that. As Melissa mentioned, we're putting together a companion survey for COGR member institutions. We're requesting much more generalized information on that one, but Bob will, of course, also be asking COGR member institutions to provide copies of contracts when they're able to, and specific issues around that. As an example of the kinds of things we're looking for on that, I have recently shared with Bob a couple of instances where we have recently had one particular DoD contracting office asking us to include operations security information clauses in the statement of work rather than the contract itself. So that's kind of a clear disconnect of, I don't understand why this is happening here. This isn't where this belongs. But those are the kinds of issues that we're really looking to address here. Next slide. And I guess I should have said just one final thing as I go off. The COGR survey it's probably about 2 weeks away, maybe next week, but probably a week after that we'll be getting that out to COGR membership. And again, please feel free to reach out to me, to reach out to Bob if you have questions about the COGR survey. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Missy and Bob. Really looking forward to any positive movement we can get on these negotiation challenges through those conversations. This is moving into a little bit more of a part of the session where we're really hoping to hear from you. What are your challenges in relation to CMMC and DDI, CUI?
Hey, Melissa.
Yeah.
Sorry, we do have a question regarding this.
Oh, okay.
I just said, sorry about that. Before we move on, so I thought this was a good question because this does come up. The level of confidentiality when we talk about contracts, the negotiations, the contracts themselves. This has been a question that comes up quite a bit. So I thought maybe we should ask the group here to answer that for our audience.
Do you mean in terms of?
Yeah.
Well, we've had issues before where we've had people say, well, if I have a 7,000 clause in my contract that prohibits publication, how does that affect my ability to actually, release or share that contract? Does that mean the contract itself is confidential? I mean, I have my own answer, but I thought maybe I'd let Bob or Missy or Melissa or anybody else want to answer that. I mean, we talk to each other all the time, right? So my answer would be contract negotiations are not confidential, particularly if there's no publication restrictions. And when you look at the clause, any clause that addresses proprietary information, most universities can't deny the existence of a contract. So you're going to be able to talk about the fact that you have a contract and that you have issues with your contract. Bob, did you want to add anything to that?
Federal contracts are public information, basically. And this didn't really come up when we did the Troublesome Clauses reports back 15 or so years ago. So I don't think that's a major concern with this, especially since it's DOD themselves asking us for the information.
Good point.
Yeah,
and,
Alex,
and just to clarify, we've always, go ahead, Missy.
Yeah, I was just going to say the one clarification I would make on this is it's most useful to COGR, to FDP, and to DOD if we can identify the institution and the contract and the contractor on the other side. But that said, I think I know Bob is also happy to share information without identifying the institutions if institutions prefer confidentiality on a specific issue.
Correct. And that's how we designed our original Troublesome Clauses database, where it does ask for contact information, but that was only for me in case I needed some clarification on, what did you mean, or why do you think this was a foreign national restriction sort of question. But people always had the choice of remaining anonymous from the public facing database. Another question is the DOD issue the survey an FDP member survey or a COGR survey? It's both.
Well, it's both.
I think the answer on that is both. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the answer is there are two distinct surveys that are going to be out. One is specifically to COGR member institutions. One is going to FDP. That pilot survey in FDP is to the contracting work group. But others can get in on either one of them if they want to contact Bob Hardy or I. We wanted to be able to get data quickly and before we could get the new FDP website up and operational, and we didn't want to make it an overwhelming experience. So So, but please.
And to clarify, FDP's role, you know, as we have federal partners that are part of this organization, our data collection is going to feed information for COGR, and they're going to use it as they have been requested to talk to DoD. But we also have DoD partners here that we can use and work together moving forward on real-time issues as things pop up. So again, that goes back to this is a good tool and way to communicate and work with our federal partners to try to streamline the process. We have a question that we'll talk about later, but.
Yeah, I think, and Bob and Missy, or certainly Alex, feel free to chime in on this, but I think it's also, sometimes it can feel a little confusing, like what is the difference between FDP and COGR? We're kind of working on similar goals, right? You know, we want to ensure compliance with laws and regulations and reduce burden and make sure that, you know, things are appropriate. But FDP is unique in that federal granting agencies or federal funding agencies are part of our membership. And of course, in the case of COGR, it's really just the recipients of federal funding that are members. And so sometimes COGR is able to submit comments in response to, you know, pending regulations or policies, or interface with a federal agency in a way that's not possible for FDP because they don't have that federal agency membership component. And in some cases, it's easier for FDP to have certain conversations because we do. And so it's a really wonderful collaboration between the two organizations when we can share information like this and tap into both of our organization members for information and really think about how to best leverage the unique relationships and conversations that are possible in both organizations to kind of move us forward on some of these topics.
Thus the word partnership, right? We're a partnership with our federal. One more question, to be clear, this is for contracts despite some of the wacky language DARPA has stuck into grants.
Yeah, you know, Alex, I think you made the point. When we did the Troublesome Clauses reports, we were kind of stunned to see that there was some of this kind of restrictions coming up in grants. And I think that's something both we and DoD and all of us would be interested in if that's
correct.
Really happening.
Yeah, and Alex, I think we're also going to be really interested in the use of OTAs.
Yeah. So anything,
I think the initial pilot survey is asking about a contract that is negotiated. So I think we are asking about CRADAs and OTAs in addition to a procurement contract. But the final database, I think, might be where we want to make sure that we're collecting information on wherever anyone is seeing these kind of wacky clauses.
Yeah, I think we have a choice that says other. So if it's really something egregious that, you know, we want DoD to hear, put it in other and just add grant. Or we can just add grant since we're still in draft form. Okay, I think that's it for questions, so we can move on to the next section. Thanks, Melissa.
Okay, so I was just going to say, you know, this in particular is where we want to hear from everyone, what your experiences are. And so just a plug for if you've got a question, either going to the participant list and clicking the little button to raise your hand if you'd like to speak, or typing your question into the chat or your comment or your experience into the chat. So DoD has sort of been ahead of the curve a little bit in its implementation of the Controlled Unclassified Information, or CUI program, for better or for worse. So there's been a DFARS clause that has implemented the CUI, or covered defense information obligations, for a few years now. Ever pushing the envelope, DoD is also moving forward with their cybersecurity maturity model certification. So Cnmc builds on the existing DFARS regulations that we've been encountering for a couple years, but adds a verification component. So the general model is based on 5 progressive levels. Each level consists of progressively more practices and processes on top of those in the lower levels. And it's expected that the RFI, RFP would indicate specifically which level would be required for any funded projects. Next slide, please. So CUI, the kind of previous or existing obligations in the DFARS clause can be met with a self-assessment that's submitted via the Fprs system. Whereas Cnmc does require certification to be obtained from a third party. You know, one of the challenges there is that, at least the last time I checked, there's sort of still a limited number of those third parties that provide the certification. So it can sometimes be difficult to obtain a vendor for that when you find yourself in need of it. The third-party certification has to be obtained for the system prior to the actual funding of the award or contract. And in addition to evaluating the individual practices, Cnmc also assesses the institutionalization. So not just the system that you're using for the contract, but how does your institution generally implement its cybersecurity practices? Next slide, please. So initial implementation by DoD is expected to be limited. No more than 15 new prime acquisitions are anticipated to be required to meet Cnmc requirements within the current fiscal year, FY 2021. We do expect that those requirements started being added into RFPs starting in October. And you know, over the next 5 years, the implementation plan does envision a time at which we would see Cnmc requirements applied to all DoD funding, including assistance agreements. So not just the contracts that we're used to encountering these issues with, but also the grants and cooperative agreements. Complete DoD coverage is targeted to be in effect by fall of 2026. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll here. So we're hoping to hear from you whether your institution has actually received a contract that includes a requirement for Cnmc third-party certification. I'm just going to give this a little bit of time here for people to enter their responses. It looks like we have some folks that have already encountered a contract that has this clause in it. If anyone is interested in sharing their experience, we would love to hear from you. Either if you want to raise your hand or enter a comment in the chat, or certainly as we get into some of our pilot data collection, I'm sure being a trailblazer on this particular topic is less fun than others.
So Melissa, this is Cindy. I was just going to say I answered no, but you know, I have gotten requests from pass-through entities for our plans for CNMC. You know, like, are you going to pursue the assessment, and even what level do you plan to pursue? So I'm assuming this is sort of like for their data in their vendor database, so that down the road, if they get ready to make an award or sub-award to Georgia Tech, they can look at that and say, oh yeah, they're good to go, or ask follow-up questions on based on what that is. But some of those questions are difficult to answer at this point.
Yeah, we're hoping not to have to deal with it in 2026, right?
Yeah, they are preparing. We had the same questionnaire sent from a few private corporate contracts asking what our level of preparedness is and warning us. I think I actually even had DOD reach out to me and ask me that and said, I know you don't have to do it now. I just wanted to give you a heads up.
Yeah. So we've received similar questionnaires, and I think that we've got some other folks adding into the chat that they've seen the same. And I think that it's potentially a kind of a common thing we see with new regulatory requirements when they're coming about from pass-through entities, particularly corporate pass-through entities, who are expecting they're going to be the first impacted probably by some of these requirements. They're, it's the big DoD contractors that are probably going to be applying for those 15 programs that require CMMC this year. And they sort of jump the gun a little bit. They get a little overly cautious, a little overly risk averse, because they don't want to be the poster child for what not to do. And so, either we might start to see in pass-through subcontracts clauses included or requirements included that aren't actually coming from the prime contract. I think that's one of the unique challenges with subcontracts, especially with company pass-through entities. But by and large, we do have about 7 folks who responded that their institution has received a contract that included CMMC requirements. But for the most part, 47% said that they haven't, and 50% aren't sure. Do have some comments, I think, added into the chat. A lot of folks saying, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one was just agreeing with Cindy that they're also seeing the same questions from pass-through sponsors, and they're pushing back if they don't have CUI contracts with that sponsor. And that's really the important point, right? Is making sure you don't have CUI, because then that might send you down a rabbit hole. And then somebody asked if any universities have engaged a third party for CMMC compliance, would you be willing to share names of companies? So I think that's actually your next poll question, correct? Or no, that's self-certification.
It's not.
Yeah, I don't think the vendors are out there yet, are they? Has anybody? That I'd be interested to hear too, if anybody's actually identified a vendor. Raise your hand, or
Ian from K-State said that he'd be willing to share his experiences via email.
Okay.
So Ian, get ready for a lot of emails.
Right.
Yeah. We also have a comment that given the number of people that are working from home due to COVID, a lot of concern that even level 1, if it's extended to people's home networks and setups, could be very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. Here's hoping by 2026, which is when I'm hoping to see my first CMMC contract. We're all back in the office, and COVID is an unpleasant memory. But I think that's a really good point, that we're probably talking about research that would have to be performed on campus to ensure the integrity of the system. All right, next slide, please. So this is another poll asking for some experiences with the CUI self-assessment process, which is supported under the current DFARS clause, and whether or not folks have started entering scores into the Fprs system. So we're asking if you've gone ahead and created a registration, if you entered a single score for your whole organization, if you're assessing individual lab or PI-based systems, if you're entering multiple scores for your organization, and then if you're just beginning your planning, if you're, one of the lucky that hasn't received a contract that would require this yet, If you answer other, if you're willing to share what your experience looks like in the chat or raise your hand and speak, that would be great. We'll give this 1 second for keep seeing a lot of responses coming back. We have one comment in the chat that the whole process of establishing the proper count and roles to be very burdensome. All right, I think the sound of the popcorn popping has slowed enough. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. It looks like about 19% of respondents have created a registration and entered at least a single score into the system, but the majority, about 15%, have entered a single score for the whole organization. The bulk of us haven't tackled the registration process yet. By and large, 28% haven't received a contract that would require it. And about 22% are just beginning planning. So next slide, please. So I've stacked my deck here a little bit with a little mini panel of folks who have started tackling the Fprs registration process and have graciously agreed to share some of their experiences, share the challenges that they've experienced with, trying to register if your institution has multiple cage codes or something like that. Do you have one person who's solely responsible for the entries, or is it a responsibility that's shared across an office or a team? If you could give one piece of advice or, any advice to a colleague who's just beginning their journey, what would that look like? So Andrea, if you want to go ahead and unmute and share some of your experiences.
Sure, thanks, Melissa. So I'm at UC San Diego Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Scripps is a department of UCSD, and we conduct classified work at Scripps. So we have 3 cage codes at UCSD for which we had to upload scores into Fprs. The biggest challenge, I think, was working with the different constituencies across UCSD and Scripps to get a handle on the scope of the work being done. Different people had different levels of transparency into the details about contracts. So, we sort of had to do a contracts primer for our main campus cybersecurity folks before we could even get the registration process moving so they could understand the work that was being done and the contract requirements. Once we figured that out, we had to get everyone set up for the different roles in the system to do the reporting. As Amanda said in the chat, that was it was a large pain. Different approvals for different requests for roles, people figuring out where to find even the requests. That took a long time. Ultimately, we decided to have one person responsible for entering all of the scores into the system, just to keep things sort of streamlined. And we decided to have that person be an IT person. Similar to other contractual assertions and certifications, we were sort of like, look, we, the contracts folks, aren't able to say, yes, we've met these requirements and we meet these standards. We need to get that information from the IT people. Just like for labor certifications, we have to get that information from our HR folks. And so we thought it would be more efficient and save back and forth to have the IT people be the ones actually entering the scores into the system. So we had trouble because at least at the time we uploaded our scores, you were only allowed to have one cage code associated with your registration in the system. So that IT person registered for the first of our 3 cage codes and then couldn't upload scores for the other 2. So I think he ended up having to email the score information so that it could be entered in on the back end, which was stressful, but it got done. And I suspect / hope they will fix that in the future, so a single person will be able to upload for multiple cage codes. So I think, bottom line, we were able to get our scores uploaded by the deadline, which was a relief. And I think the reason we were able to do that was because we had this sort of cross constituency working group, contracts and grants, export control, cybersecurity, non-cybersecurity IT people, and we were able to all come together and figure out all the details and talk through the operational challenges. And so, as with most of the stuff we work on, I think getting all those people on a call together is really the best way to ensure that you cover all your bases. And nothing's perfect, but that's the most likely way to realize success in at least meeting these minimum requirements for getting the Fprs scores in there. That's about it.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Tony, how about at your institution?
Sure. So I'm at Auburn University, and very similar to what Andrea said, some of the challenges was really figuring out the people who should be engaged. Very similar. We had our CISO, our Chief Information Security Officer. We had our Research Security Officer. We had an IT manager responsible for our research enclave in our college that does the majority of classified and CUI work. We've included, on that major team, we've included our electronic research administration group as well, within the Office of Vice President for Research Office, because a lot of the storage and where things are going to end up, they are engaged in. So we actually had a little bit of a larger team, I would say. Myself from the VPRED office, we had representation from sponsor programs as well as research compliance and some other individuals. So the largest challenge I guess we would face was coming about to, when developing the score, who was responsible for that, how it was going to get into the system, just getting the logistics in place. So not very different from what Andrea said. We got all that together and basically decided that I would be the person responsible. I guess I drew the short straw, but the reason we decided that was because it was decided that for the contracting purposes, it would be a VPRED responsibility. And I worked closely with the CISO to get the score. I was involved in the group that was putting together our score and developing as it was coming together. And also we're the office that is getting all the requests from our contractors asking us, have we submitted our score? What date did it go in? Are you willing to share information? So, since I'm signing those, I'm getting the backup of the individuals in OIT who have to approve it and confirm it. But it was a little bit easier for me to be able to have the score right at hand all this time, be able to send those right back to sponsors when they've requested them. So I don't know for the group how many people have been getting those requests, who's been handling them, but it has been easy that since I've been the person to do the score, I'm signing off on these, I'm filling in the information very quickly and getting them back to our sponsors very quickly. The system itself, we were very lucky that other than having the cyber vendor role, we've been in the PIE system, both for wide area workflow for our contracts and grants accounting group, as well as the performance management system for our Office of Sponsor Programs group to put information in. So in the main system we were in, and we had to go in and do the cybersecurity vendor role, the cyber vendor role, which was myself. Yes, you have to go through a couple. It is a little bit cumbersome. You have to go through a couple of people approving you and then getting that identification. But once you're in, what you're submitting is very easy, as long as you have that specific information, and that information should be coming from some form of team that's developed it, because you're going to be putting in your score. You're going to be putting in related to when you anticipate, if you do not meet all 110 requirements for the score, you're going to have to provide a POAM, which is a plan of action and milestones to say, when are you going to get there? Most of us are not going to be the people who have that answer. You're going to have to be working with other groups on campus that can tell you the date for that is going to be June 1 of 2021 or May 1 of 2021. And then also the system security plan, the date of that, and if it's been revised, has to go in there as well. Again, for most of us in research administration, we're not writing that or managing that. So if I talk about advice that I would give somebody who's just starting, make sure you know who the people are on your campus who are going to be working with you for these plans, and from your OIT group, who is responsible for cybersecurity, because you're going to end up becoming your best friend. That's what I've got.
I think I'm hearing a theme here so far, that the biggest piece of advice is to lock down your roles and responsibilities and make sure you're involving all the same people. Cindy, what would you add?
Yeah, I would agree with that and say, ditto to everything else that Tony and Andrea said. We have a little different situation at Georgia Tech that presents a challenge. One part is easy. We have a research institute. It has a separate contracting entity, Georgia Tech Applied Research Corporation. It's all covered by one SSP. So there's one score for that entity. Cool. The problem is on the academic side, where we have over the years allowed this lab and that lab and the other lab, and let's just say we have somewhere between probably 50 and maybe to 100, maybe even more than 100 individual SSPs out there. So technically, each one of those should be a score in SPRS, but that's not practical. And even if it was practical, I have yet to hear how you would identify a particular score with multiple contracts if you went that route. So we did come up with a temporary, practical, we think meets the spirit of the requirement solution while we're working out how to handle the bigger problem. If anyone else is in a similar situation, I would love to talk offline about how possibly to address multiple labs with separate SSPs and scores, or some way of, or if you're moving away from that approach and pushing people into a limited number of enclaves where they can do this type of research, how that's going, because that's another option that we're considering. I do have one thing to add that's going back a little more toward Cnmc, except it's not a DoD thing. This was a NASA requirement for an independent assessment that I sent to the contracting subgroup a couple of days ago. And the requirement was that we submit a plan, it's IT security plan, and then it has to be, meet the FSMA requirements and this, that, and the other if we're going to be accessing NASA systems. And then it said, in addition, the contractor shall provide evidence of a satisfactory independent assessment of the submitted plan. So my question was, do we think that independent assessment is only required if we're accessing NASA systems, or does in addition mean, despite, whether or not you're doing all this stuff, you also have to have your plan independently assessed? And fortunately, there was a NASA representative in our group, and she checked with the IT people there and said basically that independent assessment can be done by NASA Goddard, NASA HQ. She had some other, possibilities, but they do mean, independent of your institution. Not like with DoD Cnmc requirement where it has to be one of these vendors that's certified to do it, but apparently NASA itself is conducting the independent review. So I just thought I'd throw that out there because I hadn't seen that before, and so that might be new to some of you too. So back to SPRS, I don't have anything else to add.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Cindy. I mean, I think your question about driving people towards a set number of enclaves, I think that's a really interesting one, because we're hoping to do, for different reasons too, we're hoping to be able to do a little bit more of that. And one of the ways that we're trying to sell it is to say, you know, we can make it easy for you. If you are willing to use this plan that's already developed, this enclave that already exists, there's documentation that you can already use, there's, you know, template data management plan language that you can leverage for this option. The security plan is basically written for you, or you could have your own and you have to do all of this work. So sometimes if we can, you know, throw some time savers behind those kind of fewer number of enclaves or fewer number of options, we can make them a little bit more attractive, and save us all some work. You know, it's not just easier for the faculty member, it's easier for us. So I have one question in the chat about how the Fprs score differs from Cnmc, and the gist of it is, and you know, anyone else who wants to chime in, but an Fprs score is a self-assessment score. So it is compliant with the current DFARS clause, and you know, documents your self-assessment of compliance with the current NIST standards, whereas CMMC requires that certified third party to evaluate and provide you with a certification. So once CMMC is fully rolled out, I'm not 100% sure what will happen with Fprs, but we won't be able to rely on that self-assessment and that score anymore. If we can move on ahead to the next slide, if anyone does have other questions, Alex, I'm not sure if you've received any or if anyone's raised their hand. We're still in this sort of discussion phase, so I'm happy to have anyone chime in with their experiences. But I think some of the CMMC and the CUI and Fprs, some of the challenges with that compliance and those clauses, we might be able to capture from the administrative perspective with the Troublesome Clauses database effort that we're undertaking. But I think, you know, one of the places I've been hearing a little bit more about is sort of the faculty perspective, because you know, if a faculty member is having to deal with trying to track down all the people like that Tony and Andrea and Cindy are working with to try to get a score, that can feel a little bit overwhelming. It can feel like, you know, another hurdle to their research, or, you know, these are really complex requirements and complex obligations, that it can be difficult for us administrators to explain quickly and efficiently. So I also wanted to throw out there for a conversation topic, is there something that we should be considering from the faculty perspective that we might not have thought of? So I'll pause there for 1 second, just see if anyone wants to toss in any questions or comments or raise their hand. Okay, you'll have our contact information, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the session, or feel free to raise your hand or enter a question as we move forward with the rest of the session. Next slide, please. We're also, you know, continuing to keep so we've just talked a lot about CMMC and the DoD implementation of the CUI program. Fprs is specific to DoD, and we've been hearing for a number of years about the general FAR case for COI compliance that I think in the September session, I said, oh, you know, the draft clause is anticipated for public comment October to December. Wouldn't that be great? We could have a session on it in January. The new estimated comment period for the COI FAR case is March to May 2021. So won't that be great? We could have a session on it in the May meeting if that comes to fruition. There seems to be a lot of interest. You know, SGP as an organization doesn't submit comments. I think we would rely on entities like COGR to submit comments on the draft clause. But it might be a great opportunity for some of us to get together and just sort of talk through impressions and, you know, initial thoughts and implementation challenges once that draft FAR clause is released. The Information Security Oversight Office, ISOO, they have indicated that they plan to hold an ad hoc stakeholders meeting during the comment period to answer any questions. And if you're interested in getting these updates in your email inbox, just like me, you can sign up for a COI program blog where they, you know, they share information on different training opportunities, the stakeholders meetings as they're planned, updates like this update on the COI FAR case. So I've included the link to that blog if anyone is interested in signing up for those updates. Next slide, please. All right, so we're sort of moving into the data stewardship section of the session for today. There was, before we jump into the NIH policy, there was a question a little bit earlier in the session that I think might relate a little bit more to some of the data management and sharing type topics related to some of the FDP templates. And it was a question whether or not the FDP templates are applicable when a US site is sending outgoing data to a non-US site. I think with that question, feel free to clarify in the chat if I've gotten it wrong. I think with that question, you might be referring to the data transfer and use agreement templates, the DTUA. And it's not a focal point of the session today, but it is one of the major working groups. It's a collaboration between contracts and data stewardship. And those templates were designed with sharing between domestic entities in mind. So if you are, you know, sharing data with an entity where GDPR might come into play, or you have governing language or governing law type of issues, that you would be better served by making sure that that's covered in the agreement. The standard DTUA templates aren't designed with transfers outside of, or transfers to outside of the US, or transfers from outside of the US to a US institution. If you would like to leverage that template to create an agreement that would be useful for that case, we welcome anyone who would like to use the DTUA template as a starting point. We just ask that if you modify the standard language, you remove the FDP moniker so that it's clear to the recipient that the language has been changed. Moving on to, and I hope everyone else is as excited about this as I am, the final NIH policy for data management and sharing. We've seen a couple requests for information from NIH out of this, and in preparation for this final policy, and more recently a draft policy, I think that was over the summerish, springish timeframe, to finally have the policy, which was posted October 29th, with an implementation date of January 25th, 2023. So that's the date at which NIH would expect us to start including the required data management plan in applications submitted on or after January 25th. So supplemental information was posted along with the final policy. The elements of an NIH data management and sharing plan allowable costs for data management and sharing, and guidance selecting a repository for data resulting from NIH-supported research. Across these 4 documents, the final policy and the 3 supplemental documents, there's a lot of great information and guidance, but of course, I think we'll all have to do a lot more thinking and perhaps asking some questions in order to really get ready for implementation in 2023. Next slide, please. So here we have another poll, just trying to gauge where everyone's institutions might be in their planning processes. So, some of us, may not have even had the bandwidth to read the policy in detail yet because, oh my, COVID-19, foreign influence, faculty disclosures, who has time to worry about a policy that doesn't take effect until 2023? And others, may already have really great resources and policies and processes in place for compliance with NSF requirements that maybe just need to be tweaked to accommodate the NIH policy or be in other stages. If you answer other, if you want to share some additional information on where your institution's at with us in the chat, that would be great. Give this one more second. All right. It looks like the speed of answers has slowed here. Go ahead and share the results. So most of us, which is not surprising, this is a relatively new policy when all of our institutions have a lot of other things going on, are, just haven't begun tackling an implementation plan yet. That's about 68% of the folks that responded that are in that boat. And I'm mostly with you in terms of my own institution's planning. Some institutions, saw that final, about 10% saw the final policy posted and are starting their planning. About 11% began discussing implementation when the draft policy was posted. And about 6% feel that they already have really strong processes and policies in place that can be easily leveraged. I did see one comment in the chat box that all of this sort of in some way relates to data. Both the Cnmc and the CUI topics that we covered earlier, and they're planning to hold a data town hall, which sounds like a great idea. I love data, so a town hall all about data. That sounds amazing. Next slide, please. So, with the final policy posted, now we know what we're going to be expected to implement. We can really start to think about FDP, how FDP can help our community become compliant with the policy or ensure compliance with the policy, while, as is the goal of the FGP, trying to mitigate the added administrative burden associated with compliance with the new policy. One of Bob's colleagues, Jackie Bendall, is running a COGR working group. I think we've had about 2 meetings or so now of that working group, trying to get started from the COGR perspective on advocating with NIH for the resources and guidance that our institutions will need in order to maintain compliance with the new policy. And that provides a great, similar to what we talked about with the Troublesome Clauses database, potentially an opportunity for FDP to collect data on institutional readiness or needs or experiences to share with NIH to help advocate for some of the changes that we might need. Later today, we're going to talk about potentially some opportunities to collaborate with finance, audit, and costing related to the cost component. One of the elements of the supplemental information related to costs is that all of the costs associated with data management and sharing have to be incurred within the budget period of the NIH grant. And that can be really difficult when you're talking about trying to maintain data for 10 years, for example, after the end of an award. That's not free. And how would we accommodate covering the cost of that data storage within the budget period, even though it's going to be sustained for several years afterwards? There's also, when it comes to data management and sharing, very similar to folks who might remember the implementation of the NIH single IRB policy, it's got a very similar flavor where for many institutions, there's IT and data storage costs that might be built into their F&A cost base. And so how do we tease apart what costs would be considered beyond that and allocable as a direct expense versus part of the indirect cost base? There's, if we're similar to sort of what we talked about with Cnmc, where we're trying to encourage investigators to use established resources. So, in this case, it might be encouraging researchers to use some standardized repositories and leverage those resources to deposit their data after publication or when it's clean and ready. And maybe we can make that even easier by creating a standard repository of data management plans or standard sections of data management plans that address these really common repositories. It could function a little bit like the CUSP database, if folks are familiar with that. They had a session yesterday where they're trying to publish very standardized IACUC protocol language for certain procedures. We could potentially look to do something similar and help make it that much easier to use some of these repositories. So this is just some of the options. Would love to hear from folks. Either raise your hand or add something to the chat if you have a thought on how FGP can help with this policy. So I have one comment that was sent to me that it might be really useful to have a comparison between NIH and NSF requirements. I think that's a great idea, both to help those institutions who might need to make a couple tweaks to comply with the new NIH policy, and both to ask NSF and NIH if those differences are really necessary. That's a great idea. We also have one comment that this is an area where we'll need all kinds of expertise, right? So this involves sponsored projects, electronic research administration, costing, librarians, like we're all in this together. And I would add for sure faculty, researchers, postdocs, graduate students, because they're going to have a big role to play in making sure that they're writing and complying with these data management plans. And we see, Stephanie Stone has raised her hand. Stephanie, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you if you want to.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
So the keynote speaker from NCATS was, talking about data sharing and how it's going to be even more important and prevalent, COVID and post-COVID. And I have an NCATS DUA now, that's from their COVID database. And of course, it's, you know, slightly different than another NIH database and the other NIH database. So it would be great if we could get to some harmonization on the federal databases and their processes for DUAs and language.
I think that's a great thought, Stephanie. And I think, you know, I would add to that, where possible, deposit standards, right? So, you know, I think that in terms of the actual like research data elements and format and things, those are going to vary based on, of course, the specific field of the research data, but where possible to try to drive towards some standard processes and upload forms and those kinds of requirements. It's a great idea. We also have someone who's posted in the chat a link to the DMP tool, which is a great tool if folks haven't heard about this tool before. It provides a library of data management plan templates. But I think, you know, it's possible that we could go even one step further and provide actual kind of cut and paste language for certain maybe standardized repositories or something like that. Or I think maybe explore that option, because I believe DMP tool provides prompts with questions, but doesn't actually provide standardized language that can be leveraged. I could be wrong about that though. All right, if I can have the next slide, please. So I think that, you know, both the contracts and some of the things that we're seeing in the contract negotiation climate, as well as this new NIH data management and sharing policy, are going to provide us with a wealth of opportunities for new working groups, new projects, ways that the FDP can really make some impact for our membership. And so if you're interested in participating, if you've got a suggestion, even better, if you're willing to run a working group or interested in an open co-chair position, Alex's position in the contract subcommittee and the two co-chair positions for data stewardship are both vacant. I encourage you to reach out to Alex or I if you're interested in more information about our pilot survey with COGR. I encourage you to reach out to Missy, and we look forward to seeing you in May. I don't know if there's any last closing questions, or I think we're 3 minutes to the end.